this is Dana and welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. Thank you for taking time today to enjoy one of my orchid videos. This is video number 6 in my Neophyte playlist. And today's video is going to be the ultimate guide to repotting a Phalaenopsis orchid. I'm going to try to cover every question imaginable and show you how to deal with certain situations when you're repotting a Phalaenopsis, especially for the first time, because that's really what the Neophyte series is all about. It's for beginners. However, even if you are an experienced grower, you may pick up a thing or two that you might want to try. And I encourage you to go back and watch the other 5 videos in this series, because I start off with my top tips for beginning your orchid growing hobby. We are doing a Follow Me series on 6 Phalaenopsis orchids throughout the year. And there's another video for how to best shop for a Phalaenopsis orchid. So if you haven't watched the other 5, please go back and do that. Okay, so you're probably thinking, so where's the orchid? Where's the Phalaenopsis? Well, it's actually in the sink because I have been soaking it for about the last 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm going to step over here to the sink and let the water drip out just a bit. Now, the reason for the soak ahead of a repotting is to help the roots be as pliable as possible. When the roots are wet and have turned green, they are more flexible. There's less of a risk of snapping or breaking one of them while you're doing the repot. Okay, so, this orchid may not be exactly like the one you are contemplating repotting. So let me just go over a few things about this one, and we might talk about along the way some other situations that you might be faced with. Okay, so this Phalaenopsis has been in my collection for, maybe 4 or 5 years. And it was blooming when I purchased it. However, it has not bloomed since. And I believe it has been repotted just once while it has been in my care, out of the original grower's sphagnum moss, most likely, to this pot. And the orchid has done well vegetatively. It has done well with its roots. However, it has not rebloomed. And it is time to repot it nonetheless. So I'm going to be doing that today for this orchid. And you can see that it's in somewhat of a smaller pot given the size of the orchid. But the roots are clearly visible through the sides of the pot. You can tell that it doesn't particularly have a root problem. But it has grown a good bit, and the stem is sort of well above the height of the media. It has just recently lost 2 leaves, which I just naturally let drop away. So now, of course, the stem is getting sort of taller and taller out of the media. So that's also another signal that a repot is in order. It does have quite a few aerial roots, which we will be talking about as we are repotting. Now, if you are about to repot an orchid, and in the Northern Hemisphere, this is the time to address repottings, especially as bloom spikes are beginning to fade and die. So you have a couple of choices. If your orchid has a bloom spike, you can wait a little bit longer if you would like to enjoy the bloom on the plant, or you can cut the bloom spike and put it in a vase and enjoy the bloom that way while you get this orchid underway to go more into a root and vegetative growth cycle. But either way, before you repot, I am strongly suggesting that you cut the bloom spike down to the base of the plant. I'm not one of these people that recommends trying to get your Phalaenopsis to continue blooming and blooming and blooming on secondary spikes. that actually ends up weakening the plant. I am convinced of it. And while you may have more blooms throughout the year, the blooms will become smaller, they will become less frequent, they will become fewer in number as the orchid is forced to bloom over and over and over again off of that primary spike. So before you repot, cut the spike at the base of the plant, enjoy it in a vase if it hasn't completely faded, or simply discard it so that you're giving your Phalaenopsis the best chance to grow new roots and new leaves. And with good care, this orchid will rebloom for you in the next blooming season. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered some of the basics here, this Phalaenopsis is healthy. You know, it doesn't have any problems with the leaves. It doesn't particularly have any unusual root problems. But, you know, if your orchid was suffering from, you know, any kind of insect or infection, now would be the time to try to figure out how to treat that, because you don't want to let the orchid continue with some sort of situation that will just continue to make it decline over time. Okay, so the other thing that I like to do before I repot is it is a great time to dust your leaves. Now, no matter how good our housekeeping is, orchid leaves do get dusty, and I'll see if the camera can kind of pick up on that. And periodically, I just simply wipe the leaves with a damp paper towel. Now, you know, some people will say, oh, you can mix up this concoction, you can mix up that concoction, you can buy foliage spray, you can mix lemon in the water, and all kinds of, you know, things with people trying to get their leaves to look as good as possible. But truly, you know, orchid leaves, when they are mature, are meant to be a more matte color. And, you know, all of those sprays, I mean, who knows if all of that stuff is truly safe or healthy for your orchid, so why risk it? Just use a damp paper towel, and it does a fine job. The only time really that orchid leaves are going to be super shiny is when they're brand new. Okay. You can tell this newer leaf has a little bit of shine to it compared to the older leaves. Okay. So that job is done. Now, the next thing to have on hand for this job is a selection of orchid pots, because we are going to be trying to find the best fit for the root system that comes out of the old pot. You need to have your media on hand. This is the Monterey mix from Repot Me for Phalaenopsis orchids. For Phalaenopsis though, you know, use whatever good orchid bark you can find. It doesn't have to be this particular one. Your orchid media may need a little bit of adjustment depending on the frequency that you water and the environment that you're growing your orchid in. This particular one just has medium bark, some leca, a little bit of sphagnum moss, and some sponge rock. And then I have some cork pieces to go in the bottom of the pot so that the media doesn't clog the drainage holes. I have hydrogen peroxide 3% on hand to spray, you know, if I need to. Usually, if you have already repotted the orchid into your home environment, you probably won't have to spray the roots again. If you are repotting from the grower's setup, then you probably do want to spray the roots just for good measure. I have some cinnamon on hand. If you're cutting a spike, go ahead and take a little bit of cinnamon and dab the cut of the spike, but be very careful not to get this on the leaves or any of the root system, because it is a desiccant and it will dry up whatever plant tissue that it touches. Okay, and I don't have a spike, so I'm not going to be using this. If you cut away dead roots, you do not want to use the cinnamon on the roots that you cut. Okay, and let's go ahead then and get started. So I'm going to pull this out of the pot, and I'm going to try to catch this old media on some paper towel here, and then once it falls away, I will clean up my mess and then come back to an area where we can do the rest of the video with the old media discarded and out of the way. And so you'll see that it's just, it's falling away rather easily. I'm not having to force or pull. Phalaenopsis roots are some of the most forgiving roots, I think, in the orchid world. They will take a bit more handling and a bit more abuse than some other orchids that are much more sensitive to being repotted. The best time of year to do this is after blooming has stopped and the spike is fading away. However, if you have an orchid in a really dire situation, you can repot it other times of the year, but you may find that it gets set back a bit more because of that. It does have to have enough of a root system to continue hydrating itself. And, if it was badly potted and you unpot it and it doesn't have very many roots, it will struggle for a while until it's able to develop that root system that it can use to support itself. Okay, so the root system on this one looks great. There's a little bit of dead roots to cut away. But let me go ahead and stop the camera. I'm going to clean up this old media, and I'm going to take this to the sink, and the next step is to simply rinse the root system so that you can get the finer last little bits of media washed away. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, so back from the rinse of the root system at the sink. One of the things that happened while I was rinsing this is I sort of got a little bit sloppy and I accidentally got some water down into the leaf joints. Now, typically that's not a problem, especially if your orchid is still going to have a chance to dry out by nightfall. But most importantly, when you're rinsing an orchid, try not to get water down inside the very crown of the plant, because that can lead to problems. A little bit of water down in the leaf joints, not the end of the world usually if your orchid has a chance to dry, but definitely try to avoid getting water right here at the crown. All right, so now we have a nice clean root system to look at. If we start at the very, very bottom of this, the roots are kind of a yellowish, whitish kind of color. And the reason is because they were very deep inside the plastic pot. And then in addition to that, I had this orchid in a decorative pot. So those roots were down here. And they were not able to get any access to sunlight, therefore were not able to photosynthesize. So there is very little to no green pigment in these roots that were at the very bottom of the pot. They are alive, however. They are firm, they're not mushy at all, so there would be no reason to remove these white, yellowish, slightly green roots at the bottom. Now, as we work our way up, the roots become more and more green, and if a root is green, it's most likely alive. If a root is silvery gray, green, it's most likely alive. But the roots that we have to check are the ones that are brown, turning brown, or already black. Now, just because they're brown or black does not mean that they're dead and need to be cut away. So we also have to feel the roots. So, for example, if I feel this one that is sort of beginning to turn brown, it still has substance to it. It's not soggy, it's not mushy, it's not, just the string that's left. So there's no reason to cut this, but they all do need to be checked. This brown one still is very firm. Okay, now I have pre-sanitized my clippers, and you can either do that with a flame or with alcohol, but not at the same time. So pick one or the other to sanitize your clippers before you begin. And when you get to a root that is soft and mushy, like this one right here. Okay, so this one is brown, soft and mushy. If I pull on it, we will see that there's only a string left. Okay, I'm able to pull off that outer coating of the root, and only that string is left, so we can cut that away. That one is dead. All right, now moving on around. All of these are firm. There is one right here who has a tip that's a bit black. We can cut that. Now here's a root that is brown and black really, but it is still very firm, so it is not dead. The reason that it looks that way is just simply because it's old and it has turned a bit more woody compared to some of the newer roots, but no reason to cut it. It's still just fine. This one, although it looks kind of off a little bit, a good bit of it is okay. There's a little bit of a break right there. Just leave that. It's solid and firm until you get right here on the tip. And so you can tell that that's the point right there where the root is no longer alive. So you can cut that off. And here's another one. Now let's trace this all the way back. This root appears okay on the end. Green, 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 it's fine. But then you get up closer to the plant and you can tell that it is beginning to rot away. So we're gonna work ourselves in there and cut that off. This, you know, is no longer alive, and this would probably just continue to die even if it were repotted. Let's go around this way. This brown one is firm. That one is fine. Okay, so I think we just about have them all checked. Let's see this one right here. Yeah, it's brown, but it's fine. Okay. So really, that was all of the roots that needed to be trimmed. Just a few little tips and, you know, one section of a root. Not bad at all, considering. Okay. You may need to trim more or less depending on the state of your orchid and how long it's been in the pot. Okay, so now what you can see is that as this stem has grown upwards and the leaves have dropped away, there are kind of these leaf bracts that are left behind, and sometimes they are thin enough and pliable enough to just pull them away. And if you can do that without damaging the plant, that's great. But I oftentimes find that they are so tough that really the only option is to try to cut some of it away. And even then, if that one pulled, even then, you know, it's you just sometimes can't always get it all. So do your best to work some of that out. It's not critical, but if you can get rid of some of that dead tissue, you know, it is going to be buried in the media now, so, you know, you don't want to leave something down in the media that could cause trouble later. Okay, now you can even see this right here. This is the bloom spike that it had when I purchased it. So it's way down here, and it hasn't bloomed since, but that spike is still connected to the axis. Let's see if I can get just some of that off. And let's see, right here. Always be careful. Try not to poke living tissue with the sharp pointed ends of your scissors. Okay. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now, let's talk a little bit more about roots, because as we go further up the plant, the roots become aerial. Okay, they've been sticking out of the media. Some of the aerial roots down closer to the base of the plant, I'm going to show you a way to attempt to get these to sort of migrate into the media. Now, it doesn't always work because these roots have been adapted to the air, and if we just force them too far down into the media, they will likely die, which really doesn't benefit the orchid at all. But because our media now is going to be right about here where the tops of my thumbs are, some of these roots that used to be aerial will be closer and or slightly in the media. So I will show you a way to do that and hopefully have the best chance of actually getting the root to survive and or branch so that you can get newer roots in the new media. Okay, but as you get up here, these aerial roots that are in between the leaf joints, there's no way to get this in the media. And to me, these air roots are just part of the orchid's nature, and it really, to me, is even part of the beauty of the plant. I have seen some videos and some suggestion to cut these aerial roots, and that makes me cringe. It almost makes me want to cry. You know, don't cut these roots. They do benefit the orchid. They are able to attract moisture through humidity. They do photosynthesize for the plant, and they're part of the natural part of the plant, just like any other part. Please don't cut those away. All right, now, pot size. That's the next thing. So we removed this orchid from a rather small pot. It does have a pretty good root system, but Phalaenopsis orchids do not like to be over-potted, which means you don't want the roots swimming in a pot that's too large. Phalaenopsis orchids don't like that. However, this orchid does need a pot that is larger. Now, this is the largest of the pots that I brought out, and if it was all that I had, it would be okay. But let's try the next size down. This is a pot that actually had been used before, but it's been washed and cleaned, so it's fine. And I do believe we have found the perfect fit. So when you put the orchid down inside the plastic pot, you do want the existing roots to touch the sides of the pot. Orchids are not like other houseplants. You know, some other houseplants, when we pot them in potting soil, we put them in a large pot thinking that their roots are going to, you know, fill up the pot, and they usually do, but orchids are not like that. Orchids like to be typically in tighter spaces, and you don't want the roots swimming loosely inside the pot. So this pot is the perfect fit for this orchid. All right, so let's get started with the repotting. If you felt the need to spray the root system with 3% hydrogen peroxide, now would be the time to do that. So just give it a light spray. This orchid, I don't feel particularly needs it, but just for demonstration purposes. Okay. And since we have chosen a pot, let's go ahead and put some coarse pieces down in the bottom. This sort of helps a bit with air to the roots. It prevents the other media from clogging up the drainage holes. So I've chosen today to use pieces of cork bark. You can also use really, really large chunks of orchid bark. It does, you know, the same job. So a little bit of that in the bottom. And then you always want to take some of your media and put that on top. of the coarse pieces. Okay. And now we will once again check how the orchid fits. And for right now, the roots that were aerial, we're going to keep them outside the pot. And we're going to deal with those a bit differently in just a second. And if you find this to be a challenge, one of the things you can do is hold the orchid in place and slightly twist the pot, and the root system will go a bit further down into the pot. And so right now I'm checking that it's centered, and I'm checking that this part right here is about to the edge of the pot, because that's where the media is going to go. You always want the orchid to rest on top of the media, not be buried in it. Okay, so now we're just going to fill in. This is sometimes the messy part because it goes over the edge. And as you go, try to work it in between the roots. And in just a little bit, we're going to be checking for air spaces. Some airspace is good, but you really don't want large gaps. And you can tell that because it had such a good root system, it's already able to hold itself up in the pot without me, helping it. So that's a good thing. If you're ever repotting an orchid and it's still a bit wobbly at this stage, you're probably going to need a stake. This one is not going to need that. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop. I don't exactly have this pot completely filled up, but now we're going to talk about these aerial roots. Okay. And let's check for air spaces. Okay, so there's a bit of an air gap down here, bit of an air gap here. Yep, there are some air gaps we need to deal with before we go any further. So, one trick that you can use is the blunt end of a wooden skewer and go around and take the skewer and just let that media follow the skewer down. Hopefully you can see that working in the camera. It's sometimes difficult for me to see what I'm doing and make sure that it's also filming for you to see at the same time. There is a really big gap right here. And sometimes it is, a really, really big challenge to, have a perfect situation, but we're just trying to do the best we can. Okay, that's better. Not quite such an air gap right there. Let's see what's going on over here. Some people like to repot with media that has been dampened. I find that personally more difficult. especially if you have to do this where you're trying to get it to drop and fall into the open gaps. It drops and falls a whole lot easier if it's not wet. Okay, so that made the level of the media kind of drop all together, which is okay. All right. So the next thing that we're going to do is talk about these aerial roots. There are 4 here that I can actually attempt to do something with. This one is going to head down into the media just fine, I think. This one may as well, and it has a little bit of a new growth tip right there, so it may head down into the media. But these 4, I think we can do something with to try to retrain them just a little bit. On this side, you know, these 2 are coming out of the leaf joint, so we're not really going to be able to get those down into the media. This one may eventually work its way down. This one will probably become an aerial root that sticks out far again at some point in the future. All right, so let's take a look at what we can do here. Now, remember earlier I said that these air roots have already been adapted to growing in the air. So forcing them into the media is, you know, a little bit unnatural. However, we're gonna give it a shot here. And remember, I have made them really, really pliable because I want to be able to bend them. And the objective here is to not bury them completely, but just let them rest on the top of the bark. And maybe at some point they will branch. And one more. Now, if I had not soaked these air roots, there would have been no hope in the world to get these roots to fold around like this. So that is a step that is a must do before attempting this. And just in case any of them might think that they want to pop out, I do like to make these little, what I call root hooks out of paper clips. And so you take just a large paper clip and you bend out the middle portion like this, okay? And then you take the smaller side and you just straighten it out to kind of make a stake. And then this part can go over the root gently and that part in the pot. So the way this would work is you just poke that down. Okay, and then let me find another example because that one is sticking up just a bit. So let's say, for example, I want to hook this root right here. So I can put the paper clip in and push it down gently. And it will prevent that root from completely popping back up out of the pot. Now, we are going to add some extra media to the top here, not a lot, because remember, we don't want to bury these aerial roots completely. They still need to have a sense that they're in the air, otherwise they will just die. I'm trying to find some of the smaller bark pieces to layer on top. Okay. And we are finished with the ultimate Phalaenopsis repot. Some of those long aerial roots now are gone. We're going to give them an opportunity to branch and create more roots in the pot. And you can watch for that right through the side of the clear plastic. And the next step here is to give this a really, really good watering, no fertilizer. Make sure it's in a place where it's getting a little bit of light, but not too much. And continue to water it, continue to keep it hydrated. New bark will dry out more quickly than older bark, so make sure it doesn't get too dry. And in about 2 weeks, you can begin to care for it again, like you do the rest of the Phalaenopsis orchids in your collection, with a placement that gets a little bit higher light, and you can continue fertilizing at that point. All right. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please give it a thumbs up, and the subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Don't forget the other videos in the Neophyte series. Thanks for watching, and talk to you next time.